Hello, everyone. Welcome back to part 4 of the Kislev Rework proposal series. So thank you, I want to say real quick, to everyone for the feedback you've been leaving down below the videos. It'll be interesting for me to kind of see once we're at the end of this, how I feel about it versus just doing this all as one big fat video. But we'll see where it ends up. I do really appreciate y'all taking the time to leave your thoughts and things. Like I said, the very last video in this little series, I think I'll go ahead and pull up some of the comments that I find particularly interesting in regards to the subject matter, and will give my kind of thoughts and feedback on your thoughts and feedback. But in any event, we're going to plow on straight ahead. Last time we talked about the ice training and adamants, but today we are moving past the generic stuff and we're getting into faction specific, or sub-faction rather specific. So for next topic, we are going to be starting with the frigid Ice Queen herself. Katarin, when it comes to her faction effects, they're fine. They're reasonable. They're decent. I don't think there's anything that dramatically needs to change. Though one thing I do think she should do in addition to what she already does is she currently gives +3 recruitment rank to Ice Maidens, and I think it should be changed that she does it for Ice Witches and Ice Maidens. I'm not really sure why they made it where only the hero benefits. Granted, there are various characters like that in the game where they only benefit like the hero version instead of both the Lord and hero version, but I think for Katarin it would be perfectly appropriate for her to do both. Another thing that I would really want to change about her as she currently exists is her skill tree. I do think it would be really, really nice for Katarin to have a mixed lore rather than being a pure ice lore. Both of the Kislevite lores are derived from the same source and come from the same source. They are the land of Kislev itself. This is the training of the Ice Court. But obviously we have a divergent tree where they're able to specialize in this frost magic through the form of the lore of ice or the lore of tempest, which the lore of tempest is more like the wind and storm elements of frost, whereas ice is obviously more of like that frostbite, freezing cold, the ground slicking over, things like that. So they're very, very similar, but represent two sides of a coin. And for Katarin, as she is supposed to be this prodigious, amazing caster, one of the greatest since the time of Conqueen Mishka, I think it would be very, very appropriate to show her ability as this prodigy to give her a mixed lore rather than just frost magic, or ice magic. That way she has a unique flair on it compared to the rest of your characters. I have seen some people requesting that she also get Greater Arcane Conduit. Personally, I'm gonna disagree. I don't think Greater Arcane Conduit is actually appropriate for Katarin because she's very young. In the grand scheme of the Warhammer world, she's not that powerful of a wizard. She is strong, and in Kislev, she's very, very scary, but she is a prodigy as opposed to the most powerful, if that kind of makes sense. I think it could even be argued that there may well be ice witches who are much, much older that are more powerful than she is because of their experience. But Katarin represents kind of more of that raw talent that speaks to someone that was almost born to fulfill a role. She's only, even if you're generous with the Total War timeline, Katarin's only in like her 20s at the oldest. She's very, very young. Actually one of the youngest legendary lords in the game. But so I don't think Greater Arcane Conduit matches her because that's not the level of power that she wields. She has a lot of other cool like tricks and things like that, but I really don't think any of the Ice Witches should be bringing Greater Arcane Conduit to the table. I think that should be reserved for your most powerful Elven, Chaos, and Slawn wizards. I don't think any human wizard really should have Greater Arcane Conduit. That should be only for like the truly ancient, powerful creatures in the setting. Anywho, when it comes to her list of spells, I would recommend going with the following mix. So keeping in mind the 6 slots, I looked at all of them next to each other. So like which spells take up which slot. and picked one from each lore to give us a 3-3 combo that I think works really, really well. I would recommend the spells that she gets in order being Hailstorm from the Lore of Tempest. For her second slot, Gust of True Flight from the Lore of Tempest. For the third slot, Frost Blades from the Lore of Ice. For the fourth slot, Death Frost from the Lore of Ice. For the fifth slot, Blizzard from the Lore of Tempest. And for the final slot, Heart of Winter from the Lore of Ice. This would give her a pretty effective mixture of like some decent buff and damage spells. Hailstorm is both Hailstorm and Ice Maiden's Kiss are very, very popular spells. Hailstorm is a really, really powerful bombardment that is extremely popular, especially with the multiplayer community. I think it tends to perform much better than Ice Maiden's Kiss. For the second slot, I then went with Gust of True Flight, which is very, very nice because it allows you to buff the accuracy and range distance of your ranged units, which is incredibly powerful and synergizes very well with a lot of Kislevite tools and tricks. Then we have Frostblades, which I think is very important for Katarin. Frostblades literally represents her ability to enchant the weapons of her followers and give them magical ice. So giving them magic attacks and buffs to their melee damage is really important, especially when you're fighting so much chaos. Being able to reliably give magic damage to your troops is a must-have. And then Death Frost is, of course, a fantastic single target spell that allows you to essentially do a higher level Spirit Leech, but it's really good for dealing with powerful single entities. Blizzard is an incredibly popular AoE spell where you're able to throw down a big template and it causes a big blizzard storm that deals lots of damage. And then Heart of Winter, I just feel is a very iconic spell for Kislev because it was the first of its kind, being a spell that evolves over the course of the spell and has a very, very gorgeous animation. And it feels like Katarin's kind of her spell. So I think that would be the ideal mixture for her Lore of Magic, in my opinion. Obviously, if you do this, we would need to change the Ice Mistress skill, which is on her unique skill tree, so that the buff that used to grant the notable buffs to her, the Crystal Sanctuary spell, would need to be changed so they buff her Blizzard spell instead. Which, if I recall correctly, Ice Mistress just like makes them cheaper to cast, but we would need to change it from Crystal Sanctuary to Blizzard. Now, on to an actual unique mechanic for Katarin. Obviously, there isn't a ton we'd have to change about her other than stuff I've talked about in prior videos, but I want every character to have an idea, in my opinion, of something they could have that's unique. I think a lot of people really, really love when every legendary lore just has a little something to make them a little special, a little unique. It doesn't have to be game-changing, but it should be something that ties into their narrative, ties into their lore, and helps the character feel like they've got a good identity. So I've thought of one for Katarin that I'll call Ice Rituals, or Rituals of Frost. For this system, I took inspiration from the background of how Katarin managed to defeat several named characters in the lore, such as Grimgor Ironhide and Gutrot Spume. The Tzarina would unleash incredibly powerful spells using her ice magic. Against Grimgor, she unleashed a monstrous blizzard from many, many miles away that dumped so much snow in Grimgor's path that the Greenskins physically could not get past it. When the one true Git begrudgingly turned back towards the World's Edge Mountains, the storm finally abated. Eager to kill something besides the unfortunate goblins and his Wa, Grimgor immediately pivoted back to head towards Kislev, only for the ice storm to just resume without pause into its full ferocity. This enraged Grimgor beyond reason. He killed all the goblins in his army and finally gave up and went back to Red Eye Mountain. To represent these impressive ritual spells in game, I would grant Tzarina Katarin a unique menu that she can open, which contains several frosty options to mess with enemies. These should either use some kind of new unique resource to cast, or perhaps gold, simply, to represent the considerable resources needed for the casting components of the rituals. As rituals, compared to regular spells, are far more difficult, dramatic forms of sorcery that often require a significant investment in high-quality materials, preparation, ritual space, etc. They are not cheap, they are not easy, and they often take time and quite a bit of magic. Some of the choices I've thought of are as follows, but these are just examples. So one thing I'd love to see in the comment section for this video is if you have any ideas of what rituals might be available from the Rituals of Frost that Katarin could use. So the first one that comes to my mind would be an ability to conjure an immense blizzard against an enemy army, reducing their campaign movement to 0 for 1 or 2 turns. A second option I've thought of would be inflicting a debilitating cold on an enemy army or garrison, reducing their vigor in battle to tired or exhausted for, let's say, 2 to 3 turns. So if you were to engage them, it'd almost be like you caught them in march stance. A third option I've thought of would be imagine a frostbite ritual that inflicts attrition damage on an enemy army for several turns. Fourth should be something like Mishka's Embrace or Ice Queen's Caress, which allows you to target an allied army and it grants them the magical and frostbite attacks to all units for several turns. So they'd all have magic damage and they'd all have that frostbite damage where it reduces enemy speed when they get hit. And I would have that applied to missile and melee weapons. And that, I think, would feel very, very cool and thematic, almost like Katarin is able to unleash a ritual that turns an entire army into having Ice Guard type attacks instead of just the Ice Guard. Maybe we could have one called Crushing Hail that unleashes a big hailstorm on an enemy settlement, vastly reducing its income and growth for a few turns and or damages buildings. I think that would be enough options to get us started. There doesn't need to be a ton. I think maybe having somewhere in the ballpark of like 6 to 10 would be perfectly reasonable. But please do throw down some other ritual ideas below. Just remember, they need to be ice themed. So come up with a 1 or 2 word like title for them that's ice themed and explain what it would do on the campaign map. Whether it's debuffing enemy troops, dealing damage, or something else along those lines. And then explain how you take that 1 to 2 word title and make it into explaining what is the ability actually doing. All right. I think those would be the only major altercations to Katarin. So let's move on to her much more problematic rival, Supreme Patriarch Kostaltyn. He has always been a rather strange character in the grand scheme of Total War Warhammer. He feels very much like the third wheel to Katarin and Boris Ursus in the initial Kislev roster, appearing almost like a DLC legendary lord that accidentally got included in the base game, which to be fair isn't terribly far off from what actually happened. In any event, let's identify the considerable issues with everyone's favorite demagogue. The biggest problems with Kostaltyn revolve around his faction effects and lack of mechanics that synergize. The Great Orthodoxy has one powerful faction effect, that being Patriarchs receive a 20% ward save bonus when embedded in armies, which does make them extremely tanky. He also gets bonus devotion from Patriarch actions, just like how Katarin does with Ice Maidens, which, sure, why not? But from there, it just immediately collapses to the worst faction effects in the game. +5 melee attack and leadership for Kislevite warriors, Kossars, dervishes, and horse archers. This has so many problems. First off, it's incredibly weak, being a fairly negligible stat buff to the absolute weakest units in the entire Kislev roster. It's a little useful for the first few turns of the campaign, but then falls off quite quickly as the player moves on to armored Kossars and beyond. From a theme/lore point of view, it's also terrible, as these units effectively represent the rural Ungol people within the roster, as opposed to the wealthier and city-born Gospodars. Kostaltyn actively despises the Ungol culture and is trying to utterly stamp it out. Hence, why he literally starts his campaign at war with the Ungol Kindred subfaction and crushes them turn 1. He is the only Kislevite faction in the entire game who starts at war with another Kislevite faction, because he's that much of just a classist asshole. He does not like any of the more rural aspects of Kislevite culture. He thinks that they're heretics. The idea of the hag witches and the ice maidens and all this stuff, he hates it. He wants nothing to do with it. This dramatically impacts the issue of his faction feeling like it has no cohesive theme. The only other major concern that I'll point out is his very weak final skill on his unique skill tree, which is called Firebrand. Despite being the finale of what should make him unique compared to all other lords, it gives you +2 local recruitment capacity in his province and minus 25% recruitment for his army only. Very boring. Just terrible. I also think that his unique skill, Orthodoxy in Action, which makes Hollowed Forest buildings 300% more expensive to build in exchange for 25% cheaper Orthodoxy buildings and 10% additional income faction-wide from buildings, could use another work. Like, overall, I'm fine with it. I just kind of feel like the punishment is a little much for what it gives you. Maybe making Hallowed Forest like twice as expensive, I think would be fine to represent that he like really doesn't like them and all that. But 300%? That's a bit much in my opinion. Now, the good news is the rest of Kostaltyn is actually quite good. His personal lord trait is fantastic, granting his entire army frenzy, and he recovers 2 turns faster when wounded. That's amazing. He's an absolute beast in combat, being able to use all of the Kislevite prayers instead of only 2 of them, and has an incredible amount of strong passive abilities. So, how do we fix this? Well, I have faith in Creative Assembly to improve his 2 skills, which are Orthodoxy in Action and Firebrand, that are very underwhelming. I'm not going to worry about that too much. But the Great Orthodoxy as a faction needs some help. Changing the ice training, as we spoke about last video, to suit each faction will be our first major step. Kostaltyn despises magic as a heretical force, something he begrudgingly relies upon, but certainly doesn't support more than absolutely needed. Rather than handing over cash to the Ice Court, who hates him in turn, to train custom ice witches/maidens, let him instead have his orthodoxy training, building up better patriarchs and boyars with access to some exclusive traits. Just using the normal methods of building ice training grounds or animal den structures to unlock ice maidens, and only getting a single starting trait for ice maidens, which is kind of like how we talked about last video. So that takes us to unique faction mechanics and effects. For an exclusive faction effect to replace the very pitiful stat buff for tier 1 units, let's instead lean into Kostaltyn as the supreme patriarch of the Great Orthodoxy, the religious cults of Kislev that wield the favor of the gods. I would recommend that either his motherland invocations should have a hefty reduction in devotion cost, so like 50% cheaper at all times than they would be for the other factions, or they could simply be more powerful with additional effects. So imagine if with the Great Orthodoxy selects one of the 4 gods to invoke, it also buffed, let's say, the associated prayer ability. Just off the top of my head, perhaps Ursun's Roar could add the Cause Terror passive to units being buffed while his invocation is active. So they would get plus leadership, plus charge bonus, and while the invocation's active, they would get plus Cause Terror. Solyak's Lullaby could perhaps receive 2 additional uses per battle, so it could be used 5 times per battle instead of 3 times per battle, while Solyak's invocation is active. Tor's Battle Hymn could add the dazed and magical contact effect to represent thunder infusing their weapons, while Tor's invocation is active. And Daz's Song of Winter Sunlight could add the burnt and flaming contact effects, while Daz's invocation is active. Which, for those that don't know, so these contact effects, magical attacks means you do magic damage, ignore physical resistance when talking about Tor, Dazed, I want to say, lowers melee defense and speed, I think. And then burnt and flaming. Flaming means obviously you deal fire damage, which reduces regeneration and also deals bonus damage against things that have the flammability rule or, not good fire resistance. And the burnt passive is that when they would get hit, they would lower the leadership of the targets they're striking. So I would love to see both of these personally. So you could make it where Kostaltyn's invocations not only have an additional unique effect for the associated prayer. So just to be clear, these all would not be active at the same time. It would just be for whenever the appropriate invocation is active. So if you have Soliak's invocation currently going, you get the +2 additional uses. So you get 5 uses of Soliak's Lullaby, but you don't get the other 3 effects because those invocations are currently not active. And I would also give his faction that all of the invocations are 50% cheaper to unleash. Then, in addition to that, I would grant Kostaltyn a unique mechanic. One that's quite obvious, in my opinion. As something you may have noticed about the Supreme Patriarch is he likes to throw around the accusation of heresy like hotcakes. This isn't an idle threat. Kostaltyn wields the intense faith of his fellow Kislevites and their fear of chaos like a weapon to brutal effect. He's far more clever than he pretends to be, playing the part of a humble zealot that's among the common man, when in fact he's an incredibly wealthy and manipulative individual who desires power to purge those elements he believes are a threat to Kislev. He's earnest in his faith, but represents the worst aspects of inquisitorial religious acts. All that to say, give Kostaltyn a mechanic I'll call Declare Heretics. I see it as a button that when clicked allows Kostaltyn to select a faction he's encountered in campaign. This faction is declared as heretics, which immediately declares war on them and grants special bonuses and stat buffs when fighting against the faction in question, allowing him to wield the full might and authority of the cults against his enemies. It could be thematic for this declaration to cost a certain amount of devotion, perhaps the value being determined by the current diplomatic relations between the Great Orthodoxy and the target faction. So, if it's a nasty enemy he's already at war with, the Declare Heretic action is quite cheap, while a friendly neighboring faction would be far more expensive to target. It could also just be free, but he can only do it like once every 10 to 20 turns or something. Personally, I would prefer it having a variance in how much devotion it costs to declare someone a heretic, but the more your faction hates that faction, the easier it is for you to declare them a heretic. Either way, I would make the buffs against heresy factions quite hefty, as Kostaltyn convinces the people that this enemy is a spiritual and existential threat to their proud nation. The last thing I'd love to see done for Kostaltyn is granting him a faction effect to show off his deep hatred of witches. Perhaps Kostaltyn and Patriarchs could get an ability that notably increases the miscast chance of enemy spellcasters. Or maybe his faction could have a bonus melee attack and leadership when attacking armies led by enemy spellcasters. The only thing that isn't represented so far in my discussion of him is that the Great Orthodoxy is supposed to be insanely wealthy. Kostaltyn being one of the richest men in all of Kislev due to his position, despite portraying himself in a far humbler light. His orthodoxy in action skill sort of represents this by granting a plus 10% income from all buildings faction-wide, but I'd like to see it represented somehow in the faction. Like maybe his orthodoxy religious building chain structures could gain a bonus effect of improving income of other buildings in their region by 2% per tier or something. So if you built an orthodoxy building in, let's say, Arengrad, it's taking up an entire building slot, which is, a lot, but it gives you 2% bonus income from everything in Erengrad. And then if you take it to the max level, which would be tier 3, it gives you a nice 6% bonus. It's not a ton, but if you build them in the appropriate settlements where you already have some income stuff coming in, it could be like a nice bonus to encourage players to try and use Kostaltyn as a very economy-focused character in addition to his other gimmicks. You will perhaps note, this leaves Kostaltyn without any units that he really synergizes with. But in my opinion, that's due to him not really having any units in the roster that properly reflect the Great Orthodoxy. The only thing I can really think of is that perhaps due to the vast wealth and power of the cults, maybe he could have buffs for like black powder weapons due to the Orthodoxy being able to afford higher quality guns and finer powder. So maybe he could have some kind of gimmick or skill or faction effect or something that improves the missile damage of armored Kossars, Throatsi, and Ice Sleds, for instance. And Little Groms, of course. No other character fills that niche for Kislev. There isn't like a gunpowder buffing character. So I suppose he could grab that for now if he needs some units, but I don't think he does. I think it would be perfectly fine to leave Kostaltyn without any units that he's really pressed towards. So it's like, oh, you're playing Kostaltyn. Yeah, he doesn't really get buffs for units like a lot, because not all lords do. Some lords do not buff specific units. They just buff other elements of their faction, and that's it. They don't really worry about particular units. I think Kostaltyn is probably one of those characters, because if you gave him an anti-witch mechanic where like the lords in his army the lords in his faction get bonuses when fighting armies led by enemy spellcasters, and or giving Kostaltyn and Patriarchs like some kind of aura that improves spell resistance or increases miscast chance. Then you also give him the Declare Heretic mechanic, which allows him to select a potential enemy, immediately declare war on them if he hasn't already, and then he gets bonuses against them in battle. So like his armies receive stat bonuses when fighting heretics. And then doing fixing his training system, and finally giving him cheaper invocations that may also have a more powerful effect to really reward you for invoking that god and giving a more tangible battle effect to your various patriarchs. That's a lot. Like, I think that's a good set of abilities that would make him feel very, very unique and make him feel powerful. But you let me know down below, what do you think about my proposed mechanics and changes for Kostaltyn? Is there anything that you feel that I left out? Is there anything, do you think that, no, I'm ridiculous, I should be focusing more on giving him synergistic units? Do you not like the idea of the heresy system, or would you want it to work a different way? Let me know your thoughts. But that is going to wrap up this video, because I'm trying to keep them all vaguely around the same time-ish frame of like 20 to 30 minutes. So this is the end of episode 4. I will be back, of course, very, very soon with episode of 5, where we will go over Boris Ursus, and then we will talk a little bit about Mother Ostankya and wrap up a couple things. The episode 5 will be the last episode, barring the bonus, so to speak, where I'll be looking at all of your various comments and such. So I hope you all have been enjoying this kind of little series. I have seen some good feedback from y'all about lots of cool stuff, and definitely a lot of thoughts about whether you prefer this format or the longer format. Seems most people seem to prefer the longer format, where it's just like a big fat 1.5 hour video or whatever. But so I will take that into account going forward. But anyway, that is it for me today. So thank you all so much for watching. I hope you are having a lovely morning, day, or evening, wherever you may be in the world. And I will speak with you again soon. Thank you.